Hallo Freunde, es ist Zane Uhr, mehr oder weniger, in Redmond, Washington. Und jetzt ist für .NET API Review Zeit? No, Zeit's a noun, it goes earlier. Drat. Alright, welcome back. We have more red issues than Tuesday, I think. And yeah, so first up, repeat, I think, is pass meter to HTTP client handler and now also sockets HTTP handler, or other way around, or whatever. 869 or 61.
Yeah, so we had offline discussions after this. I think Noah watched the previous review and kind of very comprehensively answered all the high-level questions. We also had discussions with Steven afterwards, and we kind of reached consensus that this is the right shape. So answering that, we can go to these questions back if we want. Yeah, this was how I would open this discussion.
Oh, apparently we did already have both last time. Okay, so yeah, so the questions were really focused around: are we doing this at the right layer, or should it be on the base type, etc.
Yeah, there was one of the questions was whether we should do it on the base type. The answer is that basically if any other handler would need to implement some metrics, they basically don't do the built-in HTTP client metrics. They do their own metrics in that case, which means they would need to use their own meter with its own name. So yeah, this feature is kind of specific to what HTTP client handler and sockets HTTP handler does. And this meter is specific to their metrics, to the things they emit. So there is no point to expose it in the base type, or there is no use case for that. As when it comes to forwarding, when you instantiate these handlers in your handler chain, you can pass the custom meter if you need to. There is no need to have some weird mechanism to pass it through the handler chain. So to that particular question, that's the answer, or my answer. Noah also answered it like more comprehensively, but I think that's the key point.
Okay, yeah, and I did see, that James and Noah are both, I'll say, confident that we're not going to move off of meter soon enough that we'll laugh at this. So, okay. I think that means that all of the questions we had before were answered. Does anybody have feedback on the shape, given that the implementation position is this is in fact the correct shape?
I wonder if, given that every other property on HTTP client handler and sockets HTTP handler, literally every other property has to do with the HTTP protocol or dealing with considerations for the HTTP protocol. I wonder if this should be called something like diagnostics meter as a property name or something like that, just to really like solidify this isn't part of the protocol, this is part of the telemetry.
Diagnostics is an overloaded term, in my opinion. So we also have diagnostics handler, which means particularly distributed tracing. I think this is how it translates, and diagnostic means a couple of other things.
Sure, ignore the fact that I use the word diagnostic. Does the concern, at least at its face level, make sense? Like, would the existence of this property confuse people, given that every other property on the type literally has something to do with HTTP, or are the way that we interact with the protocol?
I don't feel like it would. Since, like, if you see the type, what type is it exposing? You see that it's some metrics related type or diagnostics related type. So I personally don't share these concerns. This concern, I don't know what do others think. And this didn't come up in our team discussions in the networking team either.
Okay, so it sounds like the networking team is confident that the existence of this
I would
property
say this didn't come up. If I would throw in this question, we would probably discuss it for a time, and most likely come out with the answer that meter name is okay. But of course, I'm guessing. I don't find it confusing, and no one came up with this.
Yeah, I mean, I find it a bit lacking in a property name. I probably also found it lacking in a type name, but it is what it is, and I can't think of a better one.
Yeah. Okay.
I might have missed the earlier one. What's the usage scenario exactly?
For this, mostly testing. So you inject your own meter, so you can verify that certain metrics were emitted on that meter. So that's the primary thing. And for DI-enabled applications, this would allow isolating the meter instances. So we don't have like a global share meter in that case, but 1 meter per container.
Just for edification, Anton, for testing, in what situation is someone looking to get the diagnostics from an HTTP client as part of testing? I understand why we would want to do it while testing HTTP client, but someone using HTTP client, when does that show up?
I mean, you can have some tests which utilize HTTP client factory and see that your logic emitted certain HTTP client events. This is how I imagine, but we would need James to answer this question because he's the one who pointed to this kind of tests and he has some test scenarios.
It'd be good to understand it. I mean, I understand that, like, I'm trying to understand if it's being used as a proxy for understanding whether the client is actually making the requests that are being requested, in which case there are better ways to do it. But if there's some other reason why you'd want to, in a test, know what HTTP client was emitting for diagnostics, it would be interesting to know what that is. Or if this is really just for our own.
I don't think, no, like, it's not for our own testing. Like, okay. I cannot answer this exactly, but this is what I remember. It is needed by other layers who would work with HTTP client and would check if HTTP client events were emitted on a meter specified by the tests themselves.
I mean, it's not uncommon for us to use like custom handlers in Kestrel tests. I don't know. I mean, obviously we've gone by this far without meter, so I'm sorry I'm not able to divide what James might be doing exactly.
Noah, do you know?
So I think this does, at least in principle, go beyond testing. I mean, like if I talk to Fowler, he'll say he really wants all the metrics that we emit to be, DI aware, so that frees his hand to go build application models that might use more than one DI container.
Yeah, like multi-tenancy, I guess, in general, trying to do things like that could be a scenario. Get metrics for each tenant.
What is customizable on the meter itself? You can customize the name, except from what I've heard, we're rejecting anything other than the one name we care about.
It's not about customizing the name. It's about verifying that the events were emitted on one particular method. Yeah, but
that's
it's
the
test.
testing
Yeah,
stage.
yeah,
That's
that's
not
true,
what
but-
Noah's talking about.
So literally, I think the only reason that you're passing in the only reason that we're passing in this custom meter is because this meter, like the object identity of this meter, is attached to a particular DI container. And that when you do exactly the same thing in a second DI container, you'll have a second object identity that's tied to that second container.
So when HTTP client is doing its counting via this meter, that object identity somehow flows as part of that?
Yeah, so when we added the new the meter factory feature that Tarek brought through, I think back in May, that feature added a scope property to meter. And so it's that scope property that I'm expecting to be different between these two meters. Like in the meter in DI container 1 would have one scope, and the meter in DI container 2 would have a second scope. And then tooling can observe those scopes and observe that they are not the same. And it can present, here's metrics that came out of container 1, and here's metrics that came out of container 2.
Okay,
How
so
is the tooling going to detect which container or scope in this case?
So, I mean, for the way that the meter factory feature wound up working is that the convention was you use the factory object as the scope. And so, like, you can call on a given container, you can call get required service, give me the factory, and then you can take that object that you get and compare it against the scope on a meter. And then that tells you, did this meter come from this factory, yes or no? And then other things can build on top of that further, like they can, associate naming with that or labeling in some way to say, this is from one container, this is from a second container.
So you're saying the tooling, if it knows which factory was added to which container, can listen to all events from all meters, and then in the event filter based on the factory instance? Do you just like a reference comparison and be like, if it came from this factory, like in the actual event handler?
Yes.
Like in the recorder or whatever we're calling it?
So like in a, you could imagine in the multi-tenanted scenario, you could filter and say, I only want to collect the metrics from my current container. I do not want the metrics from any other container. And so let me filter to just the meter that has the scope matching my current container and ignore all the meters from all of the other containers.
Yeah, like we've done that in Kestrel tests. That's like kind of how we filter out potential like concurrent tests that might be running for Kestrel when we're testing the instrumentation. But that's for like testing like Kestrel's own metrics.
So yeah, I mean,
but I get it from the perspective of if the actual meter identity, object identity, is flowing along with the instruments and the events that are raised and whatever else, then I get the idea of being able to filter based on that.
Yep.
Do we have to keep?
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I was going to say the scope seems a little ancillary in that you could just be using the meter object identity. The only thing, it seems like the scope is just a property hanging off the meter. It's just yet another object. It could be a string. It could be whatever that you could use as part of your filtering.
Yes. I mean, the main, I'd say the main reason that you likely don't wind up using the meter's object identity directly is your code in the filter doesn't know inherently which meter object was created for which container. Like the way you figure that out is then to go look at the meter.scope property.
Sure.
Because that one you can call get required service factory for the DI container and get like what's your basis for comparison. The meter itself may not be likely isn't registered in the DI container. There's no other way you can go fetch it to check, like, is this the meter that I care about?
Sure.
What about outside the process though? Like in .NET counters, there's no way to do this filtering, right? Because it's still the meters are still the same name, and the counters are still the same name, even if I have 10 of them in the process.
So there is I believe, like a little feature or a little to-do that Tarek has filed for himself as part of the follow-on work to the meter factory feature, which is to change our metrics event source is the thing that transmits all the data to .NET counters. And what we want to do is add some information on the events that we emit that encodes this container identity, so that then tooling would be aware of like what containers things are coming from, and then you could ultimately push something out into the UI.
By encodes container identity, meaning encodes the scope.
Yes.
As far as the meter is concerned, it's an arbitrary object, right?
Yes.
Right, because it's just like a constructor parameter. I remember like the last API review, it's just like an object, right, to the meter. Question, like I know this came up in an earlier API review, but why is HTTP client handler rejecting different names? Like, because that seems like it could be useful for like out of process, instruments and so forth. Is it just because it doesn't show up anywhere? I forget. Sorry, I know there was a reason.
So I can tell it. This is a spot where James and I differ in opinions. I can give you James's rationale. So James's rationale is basically to say, that we were unclear of what the scenario would be where someone wants the name to be different. And so he's basically starting from the conservative place of, we can initially not let people do that. And if they come up with a good scenario that requires them to do that, then they can, give us feedback that says like, please let us do that. And then we can always unblock it later. Whereas we can't go in reverse. We can't allow it now and then change our minds later and decide to block it. So my opinion was more, I didn't necessarily see a reason to block it, but it seemed so corner casey to me that if James thought it was important to block it, I didn't really object.
Right, because if you're able to rename it, and assuming it actually showed up when you're like listening to these meters out of process using like .NET counters or something like it, presumably, like the usefulness seems to be like, oh, I want the HTTP client stats for just my service. Like, it doesn't seem like that complicated to be like, why would you want that?
Yes, but at the same time, somebody who's using metrics as a way of, I don't know, throttling your service or doing back billing or whatever, if you change the name off of the one they expect, then you may have just snuck out of their zone. So it'll be a fun, contentious feature forever.
I feel like it's going to be possible with like, if you're like selling something to someone, like you can't rely on this anyway. Like you could use reflection, right, to like unreference the meter somehow, I'm sure. Like, so it doesn't record stuff.
So I have kind of a different question, or it's along the same lines, but like, what's our suggestion to people who are building libraries that want to expose metrics? Like, because I understand event source, right? Like I understand the pattern we tell people event source, right? You make a static event source and you write to it when when the thing happens. But like, it's really muddying in my mind what we tell people to do in their libraries for meters. Like I was reading the docs this morning, and it's like make a static meter. But now this seems to, we're not following that same.
Yes, so the docs have not been updated based on the changes that we've done in .NET 8. So I would say, you know, the guidance that we are going to update the docs to is probably going to say something like, you basically have two options. You can either create a global meter if you have no intention of, like, if your library is generally not aware of DI, you know, create a global meter and use it. If your library is aware of DI and you would like to produce metrics that can be correlated with a particular container, you know, or you like to produce different sets of metrics that can be isolated by container, then the guidance is going to say, take an iMeter factory as your constructor parameter and call create meter from that.
So we're not following that same guidance here.
Well, yeah, there's a third category then, which is you are not DI aware, but you want to somehow play nicely in a DI system because you might be constructed from somebody who is DI aware, therefore you need to accept a meter.
Yep.
Which effectively means every component will need to either take an iMeter handler or meter because you don't know how you're going to be used.
Or just like, decide you don't care.
For example, like literally what I'm doing right now is introducing meters into Redis Stack Exchange client.
Yep.
And I was going to follow the pattern of it just has a static one. And it sounds like that's not the right thing. It should be exposing a meter here. Just like it.
Right.
You can think of it just like HTTP client, right? It's not DI aware in any sort of way. It's just a normal client library that connects to a server and issues requests.
Yeah, I would say if there's no common pattern where people use it in a way that does, you know, correlate it with a DI container, then I would say, you know, yes, do that. And if it's more similar, if it's more like, you know, this HTTP client where you're like, oh, well, there is this very common scenario where, you know, it does get used from a DI aware context, and we do expect people would like to isolate those metrics per DI container, then yeah, I would suggest a pattern similar to this.
So, is it actually the case that your initial two categories of either just use a static because no one cares or you're DI aware, is the third category that we're looking at here really just HTTP client is a super special case because it is how everyone speaks to the internet and no one else will actually take a meter?
I mean, literally Redis is the exact same thing. It just doesn't speak HTTP, right?
Well, it's not. It's tied to a specific backend. It's a specific thing. It's a lot less general than HTTP client and HTTP client handler. It's a specific thing, whereas we're building something here that is the most general possible client on the internet.
Right. So you're saying things like database drivers would be a second tier?
I'm saying database drivers would, like, they just would have a static, unless they were DI, unless they were already, you know, supported dependency injection, in which case they could take an iMeter handler, iMeter factory.
I guess I'm not seeing the difference. Like, I don't see the difference between HTTP client and like Redis client or a SQL client.
The client I'm just trying to draw is order of magnitude unknowns about who's using you.
But in context of DI, all the same patterns still apply though, right? Like I would put a different DB context in my different DI containers. Same thing with like a Redis connection. And I could have multiple even inside the same container.
Yeah, I understand. I'm trying to draw a line somewhere, because in the extreme, then we're basically saying that literally every single component needs to take a meter, which is untenable.
Right, that's where I was going with my questioning, exactly. Like the static one is basically, we can't tell people to just make a static one.
I mean, certainly, if you look at, if you sort of look at the things where people are interested to have metrics, I mean, that's probably the biggest thing that might, narrow down where this tends to show up. Like I would say, metrics get used in many fewer places than logging, for example, just out of like conventionally what people are interested in. I mean, I feel like people are usually interested in metrics in places that are doing, IO of some form. So, like HTTP client does it. Database clients are another thing that are basically, doing some structured form of IO in under the covers. Another, I don't know, less common might be something like file IO or raw sockets IO or something like that. And then some other ones, like caches are another one where people often want metrics. So I mean that's one factor, is like, would the user be interested in metrics for my component? And I suspect for many things, might be no. And then I think the other question is sort of, we have a whole bunch of libraries which we don't consider to be DI aware. So that's the one where I feel like system.net feels a little special casey, in that like it's a system, system.star library, and generally things down there are not aware of DI, but we've also very explicitly put the Microsoft.extensions.http right over the top of it, and that sort of says, but it is DI aware. And I don't know how many other components have that that design point of, we sort of started with something that was designed without DI in mind, and then sort of augmented it to be DI aware.
I think for me though, like there's this long tail of components that use HTTP. Like X509 certificate might need to use HTTP client to download what are they called? The revocation lists or whatever else. Does it need to take a meter?
I mean, I guess for a lot of these things, I sort of think of it from a, are we designing that API to be DI aware? Because it seems like being DI aware sort of comes with this principle that you inject your dependencies. And it's like, well, if you want to obey that principle, then yes, you can inject meter as one of your dependencies. But I also view it as sort of the library author's prerogative to say, are they choosing to adopt that principle, or they're not choosing to adopt that principle?
But there are tons of libraries that aren't DI aware, including HTTP client.
Right, like that one, that's SSL stream effectively, right? And like for ASP.NET, like, yeah, if we were supplying a meter via DI and like Kestrel ended up like downloading some revocation list when validating a client or something, like we'd want it to use the same meter as everything else. So then SSL stream needs to take a meter, like,
which
to
just
have
doesn't
that experience work.
Right. Well, that'd be SSL stream needs to take a meter, which will be its own meter, but then needs to somehow pass the meter on to X509 chain, which would need, right? Like it's.
Well, yeah. I mean, I sort of view that as, I don't know, sort of the virality of the DI principle. Like if you try and take DI to the extreme, then it sort of says that all your dependencies start showing up all over, tons of APIs.
Right.
And
So
presumably we have not done that. Like we've not, said like, okay, everything in all of system.star is now going to have, all these new constructor parameters and properties where every dependency comes in on every API surface.
So, I mean, I think it sounds like you're saying the pattern is if you are actively participating in a DI world, use the factory. If you're not, use a
Yep.
static. And if you use a
Yep.
static and people sort of bitch, whine, and scream, then maybe you do what we do here.
Yeah, I think so. I
Okay.
mean,
But this
I guess I would try to
exposing a
make it
meter is
not-
basically never a starting position. It's a you end up there because of requests and demand.
I mean, whether or not it's a starting position, I guess I would say that just still comes down to was being sort of DI friendly your starting position. Like some people might design their API and say, yes, I'm going to be DI friendly from the get-go, and then they might do this. Others, like down in the system, I would say the default position is not to be DI.
Well,
aware
but this
of the
doesn't
starting position.
really have anything to do with DI, right? This is more you're using DI multi-tenancy and saying that's DI, and this is really multi-tenancy and not DI at all. Of wanting to isolate your data.
But I'm referring to DI like the principle, like the design principle of DI is anywhere my thingy has a dependency, I make that dependency explicit in my public API surface.
Fair enough.
So if that's your design principle for your API, well then, and you have metrics, then those two things together say, well, metrics is your dependency, and you're on a design where you make all your dependencies explicit, so therefore metric shows up. But I recognize that's not the way most system libraries are designed around that principle, and so that metrics may not show up.
Right. It's like a false promise because of that. Because to truly make it promise, it's like viral, as you pointed out. But maybe perfect shouldn't be the enemy of good enough. Like, because this will capture a lot of web application metrics for sure.
I do have. I realize I've beaten the meter versus iMeter factory thing to death. I will ask one more question related to it because it kind of ties together all the questions we've been asking.
Sure.
And that is, so we've named this meter systemnet HTTP. There's one meter that is put onto the handler, but the handler does a lot of stuff, right? And it talks to DNS and it talks to whatever else. If in the future we want to add meter support to DNS, that would probably be system.net.name resolution or system.net.dns, or it would be some other thing. It certainly wouldn't be systemnet HTTP.
Right.
Systemnet HTTP client, HTTP client handler, socket handler use DNS and use SSL and use everything else. So it can't just forward its meter down to those other things because they expect one that's a different meter. So I get how that would work with an iMeter factory because it's just passes the iMeter factory down and the thing queries for the meter that it's supposed to be using. I don't understand how that works or will eventually work with meter.
So just to make sure, so you're hypothesizing, like today, HTTP has a dependency on something that it does with DNS, and currently we're not recording any metrics for DNS.
Yeah.
But we could start recording metrics for DNS, and at that point, now we would have the need
in particular, we are reporting metrics for DNS. We're doing it with the old mechanism. We're doing it with event counter, which my understanding is now legacy and is meant to be replaced in the fullness of time with meter.
Or at least we're generally on a track where we're not sort of adding more event counters, and we're generally adding meters in parallel to event counters that we've already added.
Right.
I I don't say replace just because we're not actually eliminating the event counters, at least not yet. I mean, it's possible, many years hence we would do that, but for now I'm trying not to avoid breaking anybody.
Sure, but okay, augment.
Yep.
That.
Yep. Right.
My point was DNS already does counting of stuff, and the way of counting of stuff in the future is meant to be meter, even if it's also for compatibility and for backcompat maintaining its use of event counters. So if and when we did that, DNS would presumably need a meter, and if it needs, I mean, it's even lower level than this stuff and used in even more places, so presumably the concerns around DI also apply, wanting segregation and isolation and whatever for your different environments. Right. So it would also need a meter, and HTTP client handler or socket handler can't just pass, if I've understood correctly, can't just pass its meter, because it's a different one. It's a system that HTTP meter, not a system that DNS meter.
Yes, that is accurate.
So what do we do in that world where we're not? I get what we do if this was an iMeter factory. We really just pass it. Don't understand what we do with a meter.
So it was not one that I had thought of before. So I mean, it's good to bring it up. I could see two things that we could do. So one is we could add yet another property here that flowed that one through, and I could imagine that might produce an I roll, but that's certainly an option. The other thing I could imagine is we could say, actually, we don't want to pass through a meter, we want to pass through a func string meter instead. Basically an iMeter factory, but without the actual type iMeter factory. And then the metrics handler could use the func string meter to create itself the system net HTTP meter, and the DNS guy could use it to create itself the system net name resolution meter, something like that.
I mean, a little bit, none of this actually, the specific example doesn't matter because everything on DNS is static, so there's nowhere to stick a meter. We'd have to make all new.
Okay, you'd pass it as an argument. Or when we build our planned managed DNS client, and that allows you to configure up the wazoo how everything works, that might end up being a class.
Right. So yeah, I think the easy answer is if you're only static API, you only have static metrics. But unless you took it
I'm
as
not
an
sure
instance.
That's true. If you're static API, you take an argument, right?
If you care.
If you care. But what I'm trying to push on here is us saying that if we care about it for HTTP client handler or for HTTP client, presumably we will also care about it for DNS.
Maybe. I personally find it hard to believe that the API review would sign off on all things that look like static functions starting to take a meter factory parameter, because we don't design the BCL. Basically, we say that implementation detail is implementation detail, and we disagree with the principle of DI. So I think that would be exactly the wrong avenue to take. So static things will never participate in this. You get to control where the metrics go.
Right, and I would come back to that. That's a choice that library authors get to make as to, like, am I following the DI principle or am I not following the DI principle, and then it has the consequences either way.
Yeah, so I think, but to take Steve's question in as the general, it's, are we going to regret putting meter here versus a factory, whether that's that we figure out shaping to move meter factory lower, or if this is the func based equivalent, or is this the right answer and we just call it a day?
I've harped on it a lot, and I realize I brought it up in every discussion. And the answer has always been meter is sufficient. And so, like, at this point, I'll bite my tongue and stop. But yeah.
Actually, but this is like slightly a different question, right? Like, there's nothing stopping us from, we could find a delegate, right? Or if we want to be a funkometer options to meter, like that's a thing you could do. We haven't done anything quite like this yet, right? Where we've
why would we do that?
meter.
Why would we introduce another shape for iMeter Factory?
Right. I mean, I would eventually drive to just moving it into system diagnostics, but yeah.
So I feel like every time the question got raised before, as I understood it, the premise was always, it's still just this one meter that we want in the end, and it's just a matter of what intermediate form are we passing? Like, are we directly passing the object, or are we passing a func that you invoke the func and then you get the object? Whereas what you just raised, Stephen, feels like a new concern that I don't think had really been discussed before, which was sort of what happens if we later decide we want additional meters for other parts of the implementation that we feel should have a different identity than the current one that we've got. And
yeah, that's a good way of phrasing the concern. More generally, it's related to the discussion we were having around what do we want the ecosystem to do? Because the answer of just take a meter factory is flexible. The answer of take a meter is not.
Right. So I think honestly, it feels like there's a lot of parallel that you see in Logger, where people will ask the question, there's iLogger of T and there's iLogger factory. Which one should I take on my constructor? And I think that question generally gets answered the same way as what we want to do for meter, which is sort of say, iLogger factory is the thing you take when you want the potential to create many different loggers with different names. And iLogger of T is the thing you take when you just need one and you know what you would like to name it.
Yeah, what's interesting is like in this, oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, so far, I've basically been operating under the principle of there's only one we're interested in, and thus we can stick it there. If we now sort of say, hey, there might be more than one we'd be interested in the future, then it might push the needle towards saying, a func would be preferable.
Right, like in ASP.NET Core, taking the logger analogy, services typically take a logger, not a factory, but it's a little bit different because they fully participate in DI. So in this like HTTP client DNS example, your service would take DNS as a service, right? It wouldn't take an iLogger factory. Like, if everything fully participated, right? That would be the logical conclusion. I understand Jeremy's point, like DNS is just static APIs and would never be a service. But if it was fully designed around DI, that would be the pattern. You would take the thing directly, not the factory, but then the other things would be injecting as well.
Stefan, I should know the answer to this, but I don't. Obviously, ASP.NET is fully invested in DI and Microsoft extensions, dependency injection. But are there individual components that are sort of DI agnostic that you consume within your ASP.NET application, but themselves aren't actually DI aware? And would any of those need to take meters?
No, because in this scenario, it's just like logger, right? Anything that we'd add a meter for, we'd probably also want a logger, like for the most part. And that pretty much puts you as a service because, yeah, no one likes passing loggers as parameters.
Okay. All right, so for HTTP client handlers, HTTP handler, we're basically saying it's taking a meter and it will never need, we don't envision it ever needing to use something else that requires its own unique meter. If we're confident in saying that, then ship it.
Right.
If we're not, then I think we need to revisit it.
I mean, just your point around the DNS stuff and the possibility that would create another one. I don't know. At least it creates a little room for me to say maybe we would be better off with a func string meter rather than meter directly. I don't want to rock the boat too hard here. So I don't want to commit the networking team to anything, but I don't know if what I've suggested there, does that sound like that changes anything in a major way, Anton, or it's no big deal?
I think no, I'm also starting to slowly adopt another opinion that a function might be more future proof. And coming back to DNS, maybe it won't be exposed ever on DNS, but do we think we would ever expose it, for example, on SSL stream? Like passing a custom meter will be a need, or this multi-tenancy would be a need for SSL stream, because that's where
possibly. And then it flows back to HTTP client, right? And there, you might even want to name it something else to be this is the revocation HTTP client. Maybe not, because you probably still want the aggregate statistics. But
I can tell you, X509 chain will never participate in diagnostics because it's implemented as a Win32 function on Windows. It's a single function call on Windows. There's nowhere we can put diagnostics.
But for example, we currently have counters, event counters in SSL stream for handshake counts and duration.
Yeah, and if we want to replace them ever, and we may want to consider to meter to be injectable or configurable there as well. So yeah, I will be also safer now with a function.
But okay, the only thing I like less than taking a meter instead of an I meter factory is taking a func of string meter instead of an I meter factory.
Right, you want to move the factory. This is what gets back to the older discussion, and this is why you're saying it's the same thing.
So, I mean, does that mean that you would, I certainly have no opposition to taking the I meter factory and sticking it in system diagnostics, but I know that crossed a different boundary, I believe, for Jeremy when that came up in the past.
At that point, it stops being an interface and starts being an abstract base class following the design rules of the BCL.
I mean, we did that with time provider.
I think time provider is a little different. I think we acknowledge the fact that they're guidelines.
True.
They're not hard and fast rules. We break them all the time.
Fair enough.
And we just move it down. That's my opinion. It feels so wrong to me to say that we're fine shipping it in one assembly, we're not fine shipping it in another assembly, and because of that, we're going to start passing delegates around that are less usable, but are exactly the same signature without the names.
Right. Well,
because we're not comfortable.
I mean, my point on that one is there's a description when we were talking about the thing. There was a description that they care about the behavior of the function. So not just that you have a function that is named blank, but that it, when given the same inputs, produces the same output. So caching is implied. It's supposed to be idempotent. Once they care about the behavior, that means they actually want a class. But the argument was everything else in Microsoft extensions is an I something. We're going to be an interface just to match the pattern. So this then comes back to when we care about the design, that means it should be a class instead of an interface, and then we lose everything around it starts with I, so this should start with I too, and then we go to a class in system diagnostics. That's my real thinking on that. But if the answer is we just say screw it, we'll move iMeter factory from Microsoft extensions to system diagnostics, and it is what it is, and we all just hold our noses, then there's only a limited amount of caring I can have.
And I mean, for my point, I don't really have a strong opinion, whether that was a func string meter or an I meter factory. I would gladly do whichever of those two you guys thought was better. I'd even be fine with, I'm still fine with meter, but I think Stephen raises a fair point. There is at least there's certainly the possibility in the future that we would say, oh, it turns out there's a second one we want to plumb through here as well.
There's also, for me, there's, to Eric's point, like, what are the patterns that we tell the ecosystem to do? There's a very, like, the simplicity of, if you care about this, take an iMeter factory is much nicer than, generally you should take an iMeter factory, but in these other cases that we're having trouble actually putting the squiggly lines around, you should take a meter instead.
I think that's true. I guess it all comes down to how often you expect those to occur and maybe how much you expect people to peer into the code and try and use this as an example for their own work. My hunch, my personal guess is that it won't occur very frequently and people would not very often look at this, but that's just my hunch. I could totally be wrong. So mostly what I'm saying is, like, Stephen and Jeremy, if the two of you come to basically any agreement between the two of you, I'm happy to oblige.
I think either we ship what's on the screen right now and we deal with the potential fallout in the future, or we move iMeter factory down to system diagnostic source, changing its namespace and nothing else, and we make what's on the screen instead be an iMeter factory meter factory. At this point, we can do either of those, and I'm okay with either of those. I think the latter one is more future-proof, and I think it's also an easier story to tell people. But that is the last I will say about it.
I strongly prefer the latter option. Sorry, Jeremy.
Where was
I don't hate
default meter factory supposed to come from?
Well, add meter, I believe, in the Microsoft extensions world, like the add meter to the
add metrics,
right?
Or add metrics, sorry.
Right, because again, so going back, again, yes, they're just guidelines, but because the decision in Microsoft Extension Metrics was to have the interface with no public type implementing it, this would mean that things not using Microsoft Extensions Metrics would have a need to now go build their own iMeter factory that's supposed to probably behave exactly like the one hidden implementation they have. So I think the statement of we can just move the interface and call it a day is the worst of all worlds. And that, what's on the screen is not good, it's fine.
The only people that would need that are either folks that are using DI, in which case it's already a thing, or are in that, what I will call, more niche but relevant testing scenario. No one else needs to create one.
Right, it's not hard to implement, right? Like the default implementation.
No, it's a one line.
Depends on what it considers the cache key to be, but yeah.
This is a nullable property. It's iMeter factory iMeter factory meter factory. HTTP client does new meter internally if it's null.
For what it's worth, I would even expect people in the testing scenario, I wouldn't expect them to create their own. I would expect them to create a container, call add metrics to put the default factory into that container and use it.
Or they're using mock.
They could, but that isn't at least the pattern that we're going to propose to them. Like we're literally going to create a testing helper that lets you, aids you with your testing and will propose, this is how you can write a test of metrics. And that whole thing will not tell them to like go mock the factory. It'll just say use the default one.
Sure. But so I think the number of people that are going to write their own iMeter factory is close to zero.
Fair enough. I mean, we're Microsoft dependency injection or Microsoft Extensions dependency injection is not the only DI system. That's all I have to say about that. We're conflating using DI with using a particular implementation of DI.
I don't think we are. That's why I brought up mocking. No one implements these interfaces themselves. They have mock do it for them.
Fair enough. But, yeah. Mock probably won't implement the I'll give you the instance that I previously returned given the same input, because
you literally set it up to say set up, give it back this object.
Fair enough. All right. Like, I agree with the future proofing. I just think we're making a mistake with the iMeter factory interface, but I admit I no longer care.
So we can always add a static method somewhere in the future that gives you like the caching default one too. Like, I don't know. I don't think we're.
I think it would be just making a type and making it public.
We could.
But
like, I'm not so against the type, but like we already approved the interface, and it is. Yeah, I mean, I think it's gonna be fine.
Jeremy, before you hit submit, be aware that GitHub is having some reliability issues right now, so you might want to make a copy of everything, just in case things get lost.
Yep, I saw Kevin's note.
Okay.
And then people disagreeing with him, which is impressive.
So I realize Jeremy disagrees with me. Is there anyone else who disagrees with me? I don't want to like try and steamroll anything here. Just.
Again, I agree with the principle that the factory, ignoring the concept of the factory, that the factory is the best answer. I think that simply moving iMeter factory is the wrong answer, but coming up with the right answer will take a lot of time and effort, and nobody but me seems to think it's important, so I yield.
If we're saying move iMeter factories, it's the decision I had more questions. Sorry. There's also meter factory extensions in that assembly, which is if it has one extension method for create that takes a name, and would we move that as well? And then just get rid of extensions, diagnostics, abstractions, because it only has those two things in it?
That sounds like a good outcome.
Well,
but
it also has this guy.
I've got a feature in the works right now that would add a whole bunch of new stuff to Microsoft extensions, diagnostics, abstractions.
Okay. But the question still stands, would we move the extension method along with the interface?
That part's valid, and I would assume yes, but I'll admit I haven't thought through it.
So, to Jeremy's point, that middle thing, that middle one that you pointed at, add metrics, that isn't in the abstractions. That's in the non-abstractions assembly.
Oh, you were asking.
They're in the same namespace.
An assembly question, not a namespace question. Right, because I mean, again, apparently I haven't actually run out of caring. The extension method on the interface really just goes back to this thing should be a class, and the one create method should just defer to the other, and the static create should, I don't know, do whatever. Oh, because it's an extension, so it's an instance create. But yeah, like meter factory should be a class.
This is the point where I agree with you, Jeremy.
I actually agree too. Like, I don't think it's that bad.
And I agree to make it an abstract class. Like, that's my opinions. Totally my opinions.
I don't care.
I don't think it's that drastic.
I don't care whether it's an interface or an abstract class. I think it needs to be in system diagnostic source. And
let's do it.
One thing that everyone uses.
I don't personally have a strong opinion whether it's interface or an abstract class. I'm slightly reticent to change it just because it feels like it churns forever, and it's nice to just be done with things. I'm also not probably DI's greatest proponent, so I feel like before I did anything like that, I'd want to get input from people who are likely stronger proponents of the DI patterns than I am, whether that offends their sensibilities or whether they're like, whatever.
This is why I kind of made the analogy to like time provider. Like there were some people who were offended that that wasn't like iSystem clock, but I think people are going to be okay with that. And I think people are going to be okay with this.
I mean, the primary reason for making time provider an abstract class, from my perspective, beyond guidelines, is we do anticipate needing to extend it in the future. Plus, we wanted to have default implementations of things to enable to derive from it and change one thing, and down level, and all that together, it's way better as a class that's evolvable, that has base implementation support down level, and so on. My gut for iMeter Factory is that is not the case, but to counter my own point, if we did make it a base abstract class, there is no meter factory extensions anymore. This create method is just an overload.
Yeah, I see your point. Like it's not nearly as big of a abstract like implementation or whatever as time provider, but I think it's fine. I think it's slightly better than the interface actually, which is why I'm going on the side of the argument.
So do you want me to, I mean, I can follow. I'm assuming the biggest proponents of the interface will likely either be Fowler or maybe James. So I can follow up with them and see what they think.
That'd be helpful.
That sound good?
Yeah. And yeah. I apologize, Anton. I don't mean to be like torpedoing this on every time we bring it up. It's just this is the first time it's showing up in API, so you're the lightning rod.
No.
Yeah, it's okay. Let's do the right thing. Of course, I'm kind of worried looking at the timeline now when we're gonna ship this.
Well, you can make forward progress regardless. Add a property,
yeah.
Whichever one you think is going to be the winner. Check it in, and then we'll revise it based on.
Well, the problem is you can't add the factory property because there's no type to add.
Can we just
add it as meter for now, and we'll change it.
Yeah. Maybe we can do it in another
against
proposal.
Right. We can add it as meter, or add it as meter with the plan of hopefully changing it before preview 7 ships, but unblock you making forward progress. At least that would be my. If time is really of the essence, we don't need to block it, and we can then change it with the knowing that there'll be a little bit of churn related to that.
Just to nit on those comments, Jeremy, those are not valid anymore on line 8 and 13. It's null by default.
So is this, I know that there was a word after diagnostics, but I didn't catch it. So
Metrics.
So is this what we want to approve, what we want to suggest?
We could show it to David and James just to make sure they don't torpedo it. Like I think that's the thing, right? You want to approve like as proposed, and then this is going to come in. Like, could we, having talked about it, do this over email, or would we have to do like another meeting?
I mean, so the only question I would have of what's on screen here, if this was proposed to something else, I'm aware that I'm the one who wrote it, is, do we want to be public abstract create, or do we want to be protected abstract create core? After the only thing we would do here, I think, would be verify that options wasn't null and options name wasn't null. So maybe that's simple enough that we don't care what the implementations do. Just public virtual and public abstract tend to often come back as mistakes. But this is small enough that maybe it's fine.
This is why people like interfaces.
No, interfaces take those mistakes and multiply them.
I know, but like once you start going into like the dispose pattern and stuff, no, this is seriously why like ASP.NET developers, like when they're like, oh, it should be an abstract class, I think often like shy away, because they're like, okay, well, once we start going down that road, there's all the .NET framework design guidelines, and that's the kind of code that just is annoying to a lot of people.
Anyway, I think this, like this is a hand wavy thing here because this says it's not null, so presumably somebody, I mean, maybe meter options checked it wasn't null, but the just showing the idea, we're saying there's meter factory with the one abstract member. That's why it's abstract. We're moving it to metrics, and we're, I guess, approving both patterns and hoping that we move to this one and delete the first one.
I will note, and this is terrible. meter factory implements iDisposable.
Does it?
Yep. And I know where this is going to go. And I think this is why we just want to approve the original proposal and not like let this, because like once you go this far, people will be like, just give me the interface.
I mean,
why does dispose matter?
Like you don't have to write it; you just have to overwrite it.
Yeah, maybe we could, like, so there is a world where like meter factory just isn't iDisposable, right? And then the thing that's in DI is a derived type that's iDisposable. And that does simplify things.
Why isn't an interface, why would anybody care?
I honestly forget why it implemented it in the original API, but it's there.
I don't get your point about like why an interface is better here than an abstract class. When it's an interface, then you actually have to implement a dispose method on your implementation. But in this case,
yeah, I know. It's just, it's heavy. Like if the goal is to appease like normal like ASP.NET developers are used to interfaces, Microsoft Soft extensions, and like by extension like David and James, and make it feel like not too much, right? Like this isn't showing the public dispose method, but I mean it just makes it a little bit more heavy to swallow than just.
For who? For consumers of the class or of the interface?
Yeah, the consumers don't care. We'll see. They just get rid of an I.
I'm okay with it. Like personally, you're right. I'm trying to.
The channel follower.
Yeah, exactly. Anticipate the objections. Like you're right, like because getting back to the point of like most people are just using mock to implement this, right? Like I guess if you never call dispose, it's fine in your test.
Why do we have it as iDisposable at all?
That's another point.
The base implementation certainly isn't doing anything with resources, right? Is our default implementation?
Whatever that is, but you can register. You can register an internal type as the like implementation type with DI, and as long as like the internal type implements iDisposable, it will get disposed with a container. Now, of course, if you want to expose the hashing factory as a thing that normal people can dispose,
I think the question is basically, do we expect that you will be handing around a meter factory and transferring ownership such that you want somebody else to dispose of it? Because if you do, then you do want it as part of the abstraction.
Right. No, I agree, and that's why I was kind of surprised the original iMeter factory was iDisposable as well. Like I pointed it out because it's there, but like I don't think it's necessary.
It calls release on each of the meter registered to it. I don't know what release does exactly.
I mean, the intent certainly was that the DI container where the meter factory is sitting, that when you tear down the whole container, that would in turn dispose the factory, which then disposes all of the meters that are cached inside the factory, which ultimately sends signals to anyone listening to the telemetry, letting them know that the stream of telemetry has ended.
Right, but what I'm saying is like that's not necessary, right? You don't need iDisposable on the public type for the container to dispose the factory.
Yeah, I think
But
that's totally correct.
But now that it's moving down, it makes it even more important for this abstract class to implement iDisposable.
Does it? Because
now it's not a DI only thing, right? Now I can just
how are you getting? Well, new up what?
I mean, it goes back to the question of should the average factory, when being disposed, cascade the disposed to everything it created?
On the interface, it's docked as that's what this thing does today.
And if yes,
which we
then
just added a couple months ago.
Again, maybe means that this wouldn't be abstract because the base class would hold a reference to everything ever returned by it, so that dispose can walk that list and call dispose. But
I don't think the base class would do that, right? Like right now we have this internal type that does that, but does a test factory wouldn't have to do that. Would it?
I mean, it's a question of is it a meter factory responsibility or a DI meter factory responsibility?
Is it a problem if you don't cache it? Yeah, I guess that's the question.
It's pretty awful for performance, but
yeah,
it functionally works.
I mean, I do believe that the answer at the time was also the factory will probably never die. Like that the factory would have the lifetime of the process, therefore the dispose behavior kind of didn't matter.
Right, I remember this now. Yeah.
I mean, we do want to dispose effectively at the end of the process lifetime.
But you have a memory leak if you don't, right? Like if you're making factories, making a bunch of meters, and then just forgetting about them, and then go and make a new meter factory, make a bunch of meters, you'll have a memory leak because we cast. Internally, we have a static list of all the meters ever created.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what dispose does, is it goes and removes it from that static list.
Yes.
Now, I will point out, like, the only way to get a meter factory is either, right now, right, is to either implement it yourself or, like, add it via the extension method to a service collection, build a container, and resolve it. And, like, if you build it yourself, you can create your own type that disposes things, right? Like, if we're saying it's up to the implementer. And if you're using add metrics, you're good, even if the meter factory itself doesn't implement iDisposable, as long as the
right. But this goes back to if it's a thing that every meter factory is supposed to do, then the base class should just do it for you and save the repeated work and make sure that it adheres to what it says it does. So that's a question of, is it a behavior for a meter factory or for the DI meter factory?
Maybe we just go back to Steven's original proposal, just move it down as is, call it good.
Yo.
Because then it's like, should all that behavior actually be in the base meter factory, maintaining the cache and doing the checks and?
Well, it doesn't need. I mean, if the caching based on meter options is a thing that it's supposed to do, then the base class should do that, and then it already has the list and it can write the dispose. And a derived type can certainly override dispose to not call the dispose if it wants. But I mean, really this all goes back to when we were talking about the thing that became iMeter Factory. A lot of behaviors were described, and interfaces don't have behaviors. Interfaces have signatures. And if we think the behaviors are important, that reinforces it should be a class. We should make the class do them, which is super easy.
I'm not sure I agree with the premise that like interfaces don't have behaviors. Like, we kind of do.
Like, boom, the base class now does everything that we said that it does, and it only calls create core when the item's not cached. Solved.
I mean, to some extent, I buy that, but I mean, we have plenty of examples of where that's not true, right? I mean, if you look at INumable, iComparable, I mean, they have all plenty of behaviors and semantics attached to them that you can't even if you make it a class, you can't enforce that necessarily.
Of course. And like, I'm not sure, especially in the case of like testing and so forth, like when people want to test their own usage of a meter factory, that they're gonna like love that the cache calls can't be like tracked. And then people will be like, why wasn't this just an interface? It's like trying to be too helpful.
Yeah, I would say, like, I mean, Stefan's earlier point, I think, holds it. It does strike me as a largely aesthetical reason to do an interface, not a technological one.
I mean, if we keep it the interface, then this goes back to being an extension method on a type that exists only because we created it as an interface.
Right.
Like, one nice thing about interfaces, especially when it comes to like, I'm writing a thing that uses a meter factory because I'm doing metrics and that's the pattern we're telling everyone to use, is like, you know how to implement an interface. Once it comes to like, you know, or at least you think you do, at least in the terms of testing, because, right, like, you know what you're supposed to be calling, and most of the time you're just trying to verify that you're calling the right things at the right times, and this, like, especially for the testing scenario, which we think is one of the primary scenarios for this, right? And then having to like interpret like how create calls get translated to create core and like which ones are ignored and like what's expected when you're writing tests is going to be annoying.
If the behavior of the factory is supposed to be that the same set of meter options inputs, however that's determined, given that it has a complicated shape, that if the same set of options is supposed to return the already same created instance, then a test doing simply create goes to new is going to violate an assumption somebody's making somewhere. So it's either important or it isn't. And if it is important and it's documented, then somebody can now depend on that. And a test not doing it is not testing reality.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, you're probably not going to call it multiple times. Sorry.
So the reason the caching matters is for performance. So functionally, it works even if you don't do the caching. So if you do a test, especially a unit test, it'll work just fine without the caching.
Except then no one would ever dispose the meters when the factory is disposed.
Right. So that's one possibility, is that if you never dispose the thing, then you'll have leaked some memory.
But that's not necessarily true, right? Because in my test, I'm going to like new up a meter at the top of my test, which I'm eventually going to like return from the factory via like, you know, mock setup return. And then at the end of my test, I'll dispose the meter because I newed up the meter.
But you're not. You're passing a factory into HTTP client, which will call it with a new name, and it won't be the same meter that you gave. Or if it does, it'll get angry of, hey, I created this with the name system.http, and that's not what I got back. Like,
I mean, I guess it depends on how you write your tests, but yeah. Like, you know, you could just new it up and then assert that the name's what you expect. But yeah.
But the pattern that we're going to propose to people is not to mock this thing and not to make their own meter factory, but to actually use the standard one, and they can write a perfectly valid test that way. I mean, I can't stop people from, if it's an interface or an abstract, I can't stop them from doing it. But both for testing and for production, there's frankly only one implementation that they actually need.
But shouldn't the name be then get or create if we assume caching?
This all sounds
I
familiar.
remember this discussion. Oh, goodness. Can we just go back to...
Certainly, one of the reasons that I was hesitant to do this is I didn't necessarily want to completely redo all the design for iMeter Factory over again. I mean, just for sake of time, if for nothing else. So I'm trying to balance, helpfully discussing things with not just like endlessly spinning on this wheel.
I mean, BCL is forever.
I'd be tempted to keep, if we want to do Meter Factory as an abstract class, I'd be tempted to just try and keep the design pretty close to what we already approved for the interface.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, the shape here is the interface turned into a class, and if the answer is the base, like the create doesn't cache anything and it just defers straight to create core, that's easy. If it wants to do the caching, it can, etc. So I think if we say that this is the co-approved shape, unless anybody has feedback on the shape, then that lets this get worked out.
Yeah, so pragmatically, I don't think David or James are going to support this as this shape of an abstract class, at least. But
what do you think would be wrong with it?
The complexity.
There's no complexity. If you're implementing it, you implement create core. That's it.
Okay. I mean, I'm just calling that out.
Implementing it is exactly as it's in fact easier than the interface because you don't have to deal with dispose.
I mean, one question I have is so Stefan, is this an aesthetic argument or is there a functional argument?
I don't want to be putting words in other people's mouths, but I do think largely it is an aesthetic argument, and yeah, I mean there were a few pragmatic arguments I made earlier about it just being a little simpler to mental model, like when you're writing a test, because all you have to think about is like what your code calls, which versus how it gets translated by the abstract base class. But like we can propose it, right? Like I'm just guessing that there will be pushback. I do not know that for a fact. I am not gonna be the person to say no to this. I think it's fine.
Devin or anybody, do you guys know offhand, like, is there prior art for using abstract base classes as parameters in DI constructed code?
Yeah,
it's rare.
We've done it ourselves, but it's not the common thing.
It's Time Provider was one example. Blazor does it like more than like the hosting level, for example, which tends to go more with interfaces. But yeah, I mean, certainly there are plenty of service types that are not interfaces.
I still think, I'll stand by my assertion that I don't care. I do think it's easier to understand that iMeter Factory exposes a create method, and so you implement a create method. You walk up to a meter factory and you have to like do a little work to figure out what you're supposed to override. And then there's this thing called create core, which you have to reason about. It's more than just thinking through what does create mean. I still like the interface. I realize I'm heretical on the library team for saying so, but this is not something we expect to version over time. I think this is a keep it simple, stupid situation, but I'm also fine.
Accepting where They already wanted an overload where somebody didn't have to write the word new.
Yep.
So
Which
we do expect it to version.
Which was achievable without versioning.
No, but we do expect it to
I mean,
version because they want to. That was when we add another meter option that we think is common, we're going to overload this create.
We're still going to do that as an extension method or as an instance method here. Either way, it's adding a method somewhere. It just determines where you add it.
Right, but you said that it's an interface we don't think will version. They sort of.
I mean, in terms of abstract things.
Fair enough.
There's not going to be a create two.
Fair
the
enough.
whole reason meter options exists is to prevent there from being a create two.
Fair enough.
Right. And
exactly, and that's what we do. Yeah.
So the iMeter factory would have implemented iDisposable as well, right?
That's why this does, yeah.
Yeah.
When I doodled it first, I left it off, and then Stefan pointed out I'd missed it.
I mean,
it's
in general, like, I'm not a fan of interfaces for things that might be complicated to version, right? But I do like interfaces for cases where you just have a singular method, which arguably is the case here. So I can live with an interface. I mean, I kind of buy the aesthetic argument that Stefan brought up. It is more idiomatic, but
I think it's more idiomatic in Microsoft Extension metrics and less idiomatic in the BCL.
We have plenty of interfaces in the BCL.
Yeah, for single methods for sure. I mean, I meant more like in the context of things you hook up for DI, which, the BCL doesn't use DI. So it's like if you look at the primary use case for this thing, it's going to be in the context of DI. So that's why I'm saying, to me, it would be fine as an interface.
I mean, certainly if we were making an aesthetics argument similar to what Emo said, I expect 99% of where this thing shows up to be in something that's DI aware and like 1% the other one. So if we're picking whose aesthetic choices should win out, I would say that DI's aesthetic choices should win out.
Yeah, I think you expressed it a little better than I was, but that was kind of where I was hinted by getting it.
In pragmatically, in terms of timeline, like I think where we'll end up, and this is like what I'm trying to say about James and Fowler, like we move the interface down to diagnostic metrics and we expose that on HTTP client, and we convince you, Jeremy, that that's okay, and to hold your nose and whatever. Like, I don't think we're going to backtrack. Yeah, right? It's the most flexible thing.
You will never convince me it's the right answer. You can convince me to stop talking.
So I think if we're just, in terms of timeline and not wanting the backtrack and wanting the flexible thing, move the interface down, approve that as the new handler property, and we'll go on our merry way, I think. Like,
I mean, my semi joking comment would be, by the time we realized the interface was wrong, we probably want to reinvent the diagnostic APIs entirely anyway. So, like, I don't know.
So next
you're not wrong. Well, the nice thing about making an interface at that point is we can just slap that interface onto the meter 2 whatever and reuse it.
Exactly. So.
All right. So we want these without the middle.
You should rename to I.
Rename what to I?
The meter factory properties to the interface.
I think the property should still be meter factory, but the type.
Yeah. I mean, the type. Yeah.
That
we understood.
My spec sharp should compile. I guess this is actually all legal C sharp. Oh, no, it isn't. It's spec sharp. All right. That only took, 4 hours?
An hour and a half, I think, barely.
An hour and a half in this meeting.
Fair enough.
treat.
One question: could we move to the other metrics property, because then me and Noah could just discuss that.
I didn't even realize there was one.
Yeah. So.
Good thing you mentioned it. I almost
Okay.
went.
I did ask if I guess I didn't specifically ask if anybody wanted to adjust the agenda as sent out, but sure, we'll jump.
Yeah. So this one is the modification what we approved. It turned out to be wrong because we realized that enrichment has to take into account the HTTP response message, which wasn't the assumption of the API we approved. So we basically redesigned this thing in a way that users can register callbacks, which will be then executed by sockets HTTP handler. So those callbacks can fill a list of custom texts, which will be then used for enrichment. And yeah, so we define the context object where all the input informations will be available, and also a method to add the custom text. We consider to have a collection, but in the end decided just to have a method because we don't see a use case for removing or renaming texts for the enrichment feature, and this would help to keep it simple. In the last review, there was a concern that we should probably not expose APIs if it doesn't apply to all request metrics. The case is that it doesn't apply to all the 3 request metrics, only 2 of them, but we're gonna document that. And with this new design, we absolutely need an API because it won't work out with just exposing a key. So basically what this API would do is to store some object with a private key. Private to the HTTP client library, and expose a method to manipulate this object, which would be this add matrix enrichment callback extension method. Yeah, so we could consider moving this extension to HTTP request message, but I personally don't like that idea because at the moment this would be specific to sockets HTTP client, sockets HTTP handler and HTTP client handler, and it's kind of very specific feature, not like something for really a general public. So it feels better to me to have it over HTTP request options, and we also decided to define a new namespace for that, so it's a bit more hidden. Is it clear from how I explained it? Any questions, concerns?
I'll admit I got completely fried by the previous issue, and I'm basically not listening anymore. So hopefully somebody else is.
Should I start from scratch? Like, what is this enrichment about? Because it's also not super clear.
Is anyone paying attention right now?
I'm reading the issue.
Yeah.
I stepped away
Yes.
for the very
Yes,
beginning
we
of the intro.
Okay.
We
Because
are in fact paying attention.
I am not. I am hosting and moderating, but I have basically left the room at this point. I am out of my ability to reason about things until after I eat lunch.
I'm trying to come up with good questions. Is this only meant to be used by delegating handlers, basically, or is this also meant to be used by like normal consumers of HTTP client?
It can be used and also meant to be used according to what James told me, to basically just callers. So if you want to register some custom tags at the HTTP client call side, you can still register a delegate there. And you can also use it in diagnostic listeners. That was another use case James wanted to work. And yeah, it looks like this would solve all these cases.
And then this callback gets run when the response is received, like
Yes.
like when you return the HTTP response message.
Yes.
Well, are you sure that's the case? Because in the sample usage, they're adding headers to the request, so I'm not sure when the callback gets run.
It's reading request headers.
Yes.
It's adding a tag.
Oh, get value, not add value. Okay, yes, sorry. Yes, because the response is already available at the time that the callback runs, of course.
It will also run if there was an exception in the innermost handler, so we can also enrich based on the error info.
When is it run? It's run when all of the response headers have been received?
Or an exception occurred. So in these two cases, yeah.
Hey, isn't there a mode where you can wait for the entire response body? Isn't that like an option? Is it dependent on that?
That's implemented at the HTTP client layer.
Yes.
Oh, it's at a higher layer? I see. So it wouldn't be affected by, okay, that option.
So just the general flow here is someone, either the originator of the HTTP request message or more likely a delegating handler in the pipeline, or potentially a recipient of a diagnostic source handing out the request object, basically supplies a delegate, and their delegate hooks up custom tags. That delegate will be invoked when the response headers have been received or an exception has occurred that will prevent that from happening. All those tags are gathered up, and then after all the delegates are invoked, something happens with all those tags. Basically, they all get logged somewhere.
Yes.
Is that right?
Exactly.
They get logged. I guess I thought of tags as being like metadata that gets associated with other things that are getting logged. Are they logged just in and of themselves, or what are they tagging, I guess?
Basically, they are tagging a metric. It can be viewed as a dimension of some metric. In this case, request duration, and you can then look at request duration amongst all the dimensions. For example, protocol version. Or
all right, so these are specific. These tags are specific to that one metric, to request duration.
These are specific to request duration and request error count or something like that. So basically, the error request error count, I guess.
And if we were to add more metrics in the future related to a request completing, they would also tag that?
No, even in this case, we have a request count, a recurrent request count, and we won't apply enrichment to that because we just can't. Because when we are meeting request counter, we can only deal with information that is available when we are sending the request. Because the request can be redirected, the protocol version can be upgraded or downgraded, and we cannot take it into account. So this applies only to those request metrics which are applicable when the response is available or an error occurred.
Okay. So this is then a very, well, not very generic, but this is basically saying add data for metrics, but it only applies to a very small specific subset of metrics that won't evolve.
Yes, I would say yes. This is why it's kind of hidden away. But it's absolutely something we need.
I'm not arguing with having it. I'm wondering if even if it's buried, if it's too generically named.
I mean, this is the enrichment, kind of the name which we use across the stack up to the R9 stuff. This is why I went with this name, and obviously we can document what does it mean. I cannot imagine a descriptive name that is more specific and is not super verbose.
And we don't envision needing enrichment for any other metrics in the future.
No.
I don't think we're envisioning a separate set of enrichment tags on this same interface, but it applies to different metrics than the ones that these apply to.
Okay, so if there were more metrics that we wanted tags applied to, all of these tags would apply to it.
Yeah, I think for any future metric, I think we would just bucket it as either it gets no enrichment or it gets this enrichment.
Okay, that's a different answer than I thought I previously received. Given what you just said, then this sounds fine.
Any other thoughts or opinions or pushback?
I just want to explicitly talk about the extension method part. Like the extension method on a class, like we're doing that explicitly because we don't want this method to be on HTTP request options for everybody to see. Is that right?
Yes, and also HTTP request options is kind of a dictionary, basically. It would be very weird to add such an extension there, for me at least. So these are the two reasons.
I don't fully understand that last one, because whether it's an instance method or an extension method, it's still on HTTP request options. I do buy the argument that we're trying to hide it in a different namespace, and the only way to do that is via an extension method.
I mean, should it not be an extension method? Just questioning.
Then you can't hide it.
Well, you can still hide it in a different namespace, but it could just be a static method that took an HTTP.
Oh, you're not suggesting. I thought you were saying put it as an instance method.
Well, I mean, I'm just positing the question about the extension method in general. Like, we had a huge discussion just previously about extension methods on a class. Feels weird, right? And so, because we also like shy away from classes named blah extensions.
I mean, it could just be a static method on HTTP metrics enrichment context.
I like that.
If we expect there to be like 3 callers of this ever in the world, we'll just tell them to go look for the method there.
And it's just as hidden, right? Because it's still in this namespace.
That's kind of a new pattern, like having a callback where the way to attach it is the call stack method on the context type. Not saying I'm necessarily against it, but I don't think I haven't seen another API like that.
I'm feeling edgy after our last discussion.
The normal pattern is you put it on the class, right? Like you put it on HTTP request
of
options,
course.
But we're saying we don't want that here.
Yeah.
So one thing just to throw out there in support of the extensions is I feel like this is probably the pattern that we would recommend a third party to do if they were adding their own custom handler. So that was part of why I sort of thought that this made sense, is like if it wasn't us adding the metrics handler, if it was some third party adding metrics handler, they would not be privy to add instance methods onto our other types to sort of stick their configuration bits into the primary types. It happens that we have that ability, but this is sort of saying let's act as if we're a third party and do it the way we would tell a third party to do it. But
yes and no. I mean, it depends on whether you're considering HTTP metrics enrichment context to be part of this particular callback or not. If it's part of this callback, then that third party would be defining their own third party enrichment context.
Right.
In which case they could put the. Oh, you were debating not putting it as a static method onto HTTP metrics enrichment's context. You were talking about putting it as an instance method onto HTTP request options.
Yes.
Got it. Okay,
like,
I misunderstood.
The third
Yes,
party they wouldn't have that option available to them.
Yes.
But all that said, like I'm not picky. Like if it works, I'm happy.
Am I correct that we expect like the number of people that are going to call this method can be counted on one hand? Maybe even the number of call sites to this method can be counted on one hand.
That's my opinion, at least. I think James seems to have a broader notion, I think, of where this might be called. I'm expecting the one-hand set of callers.
Yeah, so there are like multiple cat callbacks, so attach is definitely not a name I like because it will create a list internally. And I honestly like better to be an extension method because it doesn't feel like it belongs to context, like something that adds. Context is an object that is going to be created on the process of enrichment, and
well, but this is
not something we.
This is static, not instance. So it's just saying you.
I
so
understand.
you'd say HTTP
Yeah.
metrics enrichment context dot, and then attach is just, it seemed better than this long verb once you look at the context of the static call. That was just a straw man I wrote in.
But at edge, for me, it implies that you attach a single callback. Not like to maintain a list of callbacks.
Oh. Because it can be called more than once.
Exactly, yes.
Sure. Sure. I mean, words.
So I still like the extension better, but I'm fine with any option.
Yeah. Well, so in the point that Eric, I think it was Eric, made, we prefer extensions types to not say they're extensions types. Like it could be an extension method, but ideally the type would be named and designed as a static call, and then just for convenience it becomes an extension method. I know that it's hard to find examples of where we do that, but it's a thing that we've said in the past we think is a good answer. That generally putting extensions on the end of a thing is a sign that something complicated has happened, and something complicated hasn't happened here.
So, Jeremy, is your proposal just to take that name and just remove the word extensions from the end of it?
Yeah, like if you think it would be completely fine for somebody to call HTTP request options metrics dot add metrics enrichment callback options comma callback, then yeah.
Seems fine to me. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts. I mean,
I don't know what else would
finding a choice for me.
Don't know what else would go on that type, so it's hard for me to say if the type has a good name. But
who maintains that state, by the way? Is that logically attached to the options?
Yes.
Yep.
So yeah.
And so the only reason we don't make it an instance method on options is because we don't want people to call it?
Because we want them to have opted into the subname space before they see it. Yeah.
I mean, the other thing that I said was just attempting to write the code ourselves the way I believe we would give guidance to third parties to use that type. Like, third parties do not have the ability to add instance methods onto options. It's intended to be like an extensible dictionary for people to put their stuff into. And so the way anyone else would do it that isn't us is that they would have to either write a static method, an extension method, you know, something else to populate something in there.
Gotcha.
But aside from us like cheating with the implementation, like us adding an instance method would be equivalent to someone adding an extension method with the same namespace as the request options, right? Like from how it's used. Yep. So like if we thought it was important enough, I don't think it's like a terrible thing to put it on request options. Like we wouldn't put in an extension method if we were gonna keep it in the same namespace, right?
I mean, when I initially proposed it, I think I did have it in the same namespace as an extension method.
Oh.
Like,
okay.
But again, I'm not trying to be picky here. I'm pretty wide open as long as functionally it works and people think it's a decent pattern. I just arrived at that one because I was like, well, what would we tell a third party to write? And then like, this is sort of us implementing our own extensibility mechanism. So like, why wouldn't we do it the same way we would tell every other third party to do it?
And then logically, how would the third party maintain its state? They would just use a conditional weak table or something?
The options object is a dictionary. Like you can just add key value pairs to it and then query those key value pairs back.
But this is clearly special because something has to be invoking this callback.
Yes, it will be our matrix logic.
Right, which means that this isn't something that could be written by a third party because there's no
no they
cannot
would hook into. Yeah, so it will register a key that is private to the library.
Right.
So we are cheating.
Wait. Yeah. So I'm saying a third party could create their own metrics handler middleware, and then in their implementation of the middleware, they can read things from the options the same as we're doing, and then like the thing they read from the options can be a list of callbacks, and then they could invoke their callbacks.
By middleware, do you mean like they would register their own delegating handler?
Right.
With the extension method? Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I'm not encouraging them to do it because we're doing it for them, but I'm just saying, in principle, like a third party could write this.
But while they could shove something into options, they can't, as far as I know, there's nowhere that they could intercept, oh, an exception has happened, let's go invoke this callback. Like that.
Oh, you're send async.
They're not part of that.
Yeah, in their handler.
I mean, it's easy to run code at that time.
Fair enough.
That was almost my question too. But yeah, no, like people won't need this because I was going to be like, are people going to call this just to inject code at this particular time and like not use the add tag? But they won't. I don't.
So yes, they could. Okay, so if they called the base send async in a try, then in their own catch they could do the callback with the exception, and otherwise they just do a code after. Okay.
I mean, I don't think our metrics handler is doing anything that a third party couldn't do. I'm pretty sure the only thing that's special for us is that we're inserting our handler at a location in the chain that is private to like the part of the chain we control. Whereas if a third party were doing it, they would have to put it in sort of the public part of the chain.
Yeah, which means we handle redirects. So we emit a matrix for each redirect, while a third party couldn't do it. So
to Tob's point, that if we do the static method on the context class, right? Like a third party could do this exact same and would have to do this exact same pattern because they can't use our HTTP metrics enrichment context because that thing's not even instantiatable, right? There's no constructor on it.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
They can't reuse HTTP metrics enrichment context, they would have to define their own third-party enrichment.
Yeah. This is not meant to be used by other handlers, exactly.
Right, exactly. And that's what I'm saying is like, then they would make their own context with their own static void add callback. So the extension method isn't, you can do it just like a third party would without using the extension method.
Honestly, I think third party would implement everything related to enrichment and metrics in a delegating handler. They don't need to bother with this. The reason we need to bother with this because sockets HTTP handler is not deconstructible. I think it's like a very big discussion if we wanted to make it deconstructible, but we need this feature now. So this is a way to inject a callback when metrics are enabled, when there is someone listening to those metrics and we want enrichment. So this is really specific to what we are doing. Yeah.
So Eric, so I agree with you. There's definitely options that don't use an extension method, including something that a third party can implement that doesn't use an extension method. I picked extension method because I assumed that is what we would recommend for a third party to use. If we don't think we would recommend that a third party do it, like we would recommend that they do the static method instead, that's fine. We do have at least the example of R9 came before us and they implemented their own handler that does metrics enrichment, and they needed to pass things in options that their handler would consume, and then the way they put it in the options is they defined an extension method. Well, I think they actually define their extension method on HTTP request directly rather than on options. So I only picked options to try and not make this so advertised.
So obviously this is personal opinion, but like I despise extension methods, especially when there's just as good of a way else. Because like if you see somebody calling, options.add metrics enrichment callback, and then you try calling it, it's like, well, I can't find this method. It's like, well, it's because you forgot to import this namespace, right? It's totally a personal, allergic reaction to extension methods, but
okay.
Yeah. So that's why I'm pushing back on the extension method, because it's like, do we really need this as an extension method? We want to hide it from people anyway. We don't expect people to call it. So
I think in like this case, even if you had written HTTP metrics enrichment context dot add enrichment callback options, whatever, right? Like you'd still get an error saying like you need to use things if you didn't have metrics. And like,
but at least
the name is Googleable. Okay.
Well, at least there I can like type in that name, right? HTTP metrics enrichment context, and I know it's a static method on that class, right?
Yeah, you can Google add metrics enrichment callback, and
that's
I
a
don't know,
probably
like,
unique enough name. But if it was, dot add callback, good luck.
Yeah, fair. But it's not.
Right.
So at least that's the background where I'm coming from. Is I don't like adding extension methods when we own heaps. So, but if that's what we think is the best approach of API for this, I'm fine with it.
It was my intuition, but I totally defer to this group in terms of saying what you think is aesthetically most conventional. Like as long as the scenario functions, I'm happy. And so, if the group consensus is like, nah, let's avoid extension methods, let's do static instead, it's fine by me.
I don't have a strong opinion on the extension versus not, but for a feature that is like as niche as they come, not saying it's not valuable, but in terms of the people that need to interact with it,
I agree.
we're basically this will show up. All it takes is to dot off of request options and have the namespace included. And then we're basically saying that our metrics enrichment is the metrics enrichment. So my small preference is just keep it buried off in whatever that enrichment context type is. Let it interact with this thing. Anyone else that wants to have one can do the exact same thing. You basically take the options that you want it to shove its data into.
Yep.
To me, that feels, I agree, it is totally not user friendly in terms of like, you don't just discover this thing. But this is also one situation where we leaning more towards making it harder for people to accidentally find it might not be a bad thing.
Are we really that worried about people accidentally finding it?
I'm not worried about people doing it, but in terms of it showing up, then it's this like I think people will see it. And
with tooling and stuff.
This isn't meant for end users, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's the fun. Like I think more with James. Maybe I'm more concerned with like the power users. But I see your point. Like options is just a super common type.
Again, it's not a hard leaning. I would be fine with either. But for something that, you know, we expect 99.999% of developers using .NET to never need or benefit from seeing, making it a little bit harder to see it doesn't seem like a bad thing.
And if it needs more exposure later, then we can add a type to hold an extension method, and it'll just alias the existing static.
No, I'm totally fine if it's buried. I mean, I suggested it on options in the first place and not on requests because I was trying to somewhat bury it. I think you guys are just pushing it another notch and saying we can bury it even further.
We have the capability. We have the technology. Is that what it is?
There, now it's hidden even more.
And Anton, I just want to, like, I'm not proposing anything that messes you up, I assume.
No, not at all. I think options is not that common already. I think it's already for power users, but at this point I'm fine with either choice we make.
Yeah,
I don't really care.
It just sounds like Steven just isn't ready to commit to meter and metrics.
Well,
just doesn't quite believe yet.
Yeah, I mean, just the thing of making it a static on the context type is it solves a little bit the problem of like, well, do we just lop off extensions and are we happy with this name here, and or do we ship a type with extensions even though we say we don't like that? And so I lean toward having one type for this instead of two, and then we just need to name this guy.
I'm okay with that. I'm sure James won't like this, but because it's not user friendly.
It's not supposed to be.
Matter.
I mean, I think the thing we're saying of the user count is so low that we don't care about friendly.
I think that's probably one of the points of disagreement is that, like, I believe the usage is going to be extremely low. I don't think James believes it will be common, but he probably has a higher expectation of usage than I do, for example.
Exactly. I think I'm more with James too. Power users are people too. But, you know, to the point, you can always add the extension method later, and no one's going to be sad that there's this add callback method on enrichment context, really.
Can we just take the sample code from the API proposal and rewrite it with the new syntax? Yeah, this one. Like, I mean, it is a bit unfortunate that the type name is humongously large, right? That is a little bit unfortunate, but well, I guess it is still shorter than the original syntax.
You haven't passed in the options yet, though.
Yeah. I mean, what is then? Where the options come from?
Options.
Requested option. Yeah. I mean, that's not terrible, right?
It's not good, but it wasn't meant to be good. I mean, that's kind of the whole point.
I mean, it wasn't good in the first place, so.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, like the previous one wasn't much more, discoverable either, right? Like, is it really intuitive to invoke a method on the options?
Because Visual Studio will like hunt down extension methods and namespaces you haven't used. So that's like the other side of this that I'm sure
I get it,
Steven's
but
like,
would you know to look in options? I mean, is that the place where you would look?
Look
maybe.
in options and include the namespace.
Right, but
yeah, I mean, that one is
well, the
versus
might
here
still show you even if you haven't included the namespace.
But if you know you want a metrics enrichment context and you're already looking at the type, the fact that it has this static add callback on it, it was right there in your face. It's all contained within the one type that's doing this work, and I think that's actually increasing discoverability.
People aren't, unless they already know about it, at which point discoverability doesn't matter. Like, no one's looking at the context. They might be looking at the options, and Visual Studio might give that as an autocomplete option. Even if you haven't used metrics yet, I'm pretty sure I've seen Visual Studio do that. At least oftentimes they'll suggest imports, and as it's giving you extension method autocompletion.
Yeah. So, does anybody have a name better than add callback?
We can add the extension method later. Yeah.
Sorry, was there a question?
Does anybody have a better name than add callback, or are we good?
Add options callback?
Is add actually adding, or is it replacing an existing callback?
It's adding a callback to a list of callbacks.
Okay. Great.
Add enrichment callback maybe, but the type has already the name enrichment.
My only thought was to put the word options in it in reference to the HTTP request options, but it's I don't really care.
It's the first parameter, and like it's kind of arbitrary that it's on options to begin with. Yeah. So I wouldn't, upgrade that to part of the name.
That's fine.
Does this mean we got 2 issues approved today?
Yep. Metrics issues apparently take a long time. At some point we'll have done enough that we have a pattern we can fall back on, but I think that was our biggest piece, is we're inventing new paradigms here. That takes a while.
I'm curious to see if we ever do this again. A context with a static method to add a callback for itself.
I mean, signal registration just does that, right? The signal registration context or handler, or whatever it's called, POSIX signal registration. There's a .create. It's kind of the same thing.
But not POSIX signal context. I am looking.
All right.
Yeah, it's not exact. That's true. It's not the exact same pattern.
Well, unless new metrics things pop up over the weekend that get higher sorting order on Emo's current sorting metrics, it looks like we will be moving on to non-metrics things on Tuesday. No, Tuesday's a holiday. Next Thursday. Right, so, and with that, for those of you who are not in the United States and don't care about U.S. holidays, Tuesday will be the 4th of July, and since most of the people in this group are in the United States, we will be not working on that day. And so no review on Tuesday, but we will see you again next Thursday at 10 a.m. Modulo details, Redmond time, same .NET time, same .NET channel. Thanks for joining us, and see you then. Auf Wiedersehen.
Bye-bye.